lawmakers, not surprisingly, like many of us, are trying to grapple with what AI is, what are the impacts on our everyday life. And one of the things lawmakers are particularly excited about, worried about, is AI in election spaces. They're worried about deepfakes that could pretend to be politicians and then say things they didn't actually say. And they want to regulate that, understandably, sort of to prevent those kind of things from happening. I try to point out to folks I talk to that there is already a lot of laws that deal with these kind of things. If you're engaged in fraud, that is fraud, and you can be prosecuted for those kind of things. But since AI is kind of the hot new thing, a lot of legislators want to get in on the ground floor and promote those kind of things, particularly with bills talking about politics and political and issue areas.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the spooky edition of the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Since it's Halloween and everybody's sharing scary stories, we wanted to share one. But it's not a ghost story, it's about your personal information potentially being exposed. You know, there are thousands of nonprofits out there, and all rely on donations to operate. Well, normally, when you give to a charitable organization, you don't worry about your safety if your information is exposed. But here's a scary thought. What if you donate to a nonprofit that works on hot-button political issues? More than likely, you don't want your home address exposed for anyone to find, but some states are trying to make that a reality. So why are they trying to do this? Let's talk about it with our guest for today, Scott Blackburn, who's a First Amendment policy expert. Scott, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for trying to scare us all, I guess, as we celebrate Halloween. But there are real threats out there that are scary, and the First Amendment's seemingly always under attack. But there's some real, it's for being one of our foundational rights. It just seems like there's a lot of people that want to attack it.
Yeah, it turns out that politicians themselves get a little scared when anyone takes actions that might threaten their political power. And sometimes that means they're going to come after us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, all right, so we're talking about nonprofits and the donations that they get. So before we kind of get into the states, what they're trying to do, maybe tell me, what is a nonprofit in the eyes of the law?
Sure. So the idea of a nonprofit really goes back before sort of tax status and anything. It's a fundamental part of American history. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about community and charity and how Americans would group together and associate to solve problems in their communities long before we had an IRS or nonprofit tax status or deductions or political committees or anything like that. So the idea of free association is very American and really goes back to the founding. That idea's matured, and when we eventually did have an IRS and income taxes, we decided to protect that sector by implementing nonprofit organizations. And that has evolved over many, many years with lots of different types of things. But the most obvious and most principal one for most people is a 501c3 organization, which is a charity. These are churches. These are the groups you give to that have educational purposes, that have spiritual purposes. Anything like this falls into the 501c3 category of a nonprofit. And then on the other end of the nonprofit spectrum, still not being taxed by the IRS, are sort of purely political organizations. These are campaigns, things like that, and they run 527s. And then in the middle, for groups that do some political activity and some not political activity, we have another number of other categories of classification. And each one, as you might expect in the IRS, is complicated and has slightly different rules. But all of them fall into the bucket of nonprofits that we as an American society look to protect and thrive and really part of the American experiment.
Yeah, I guess, speaking just from my perspective, I think a lot of our listeners would share it. Nonprofits are some of the most admirable organizations when we think of things that are doing really good things, like the American Red Cross and all the medical related ones, and just when we think of charities, that's this. And so I think it's so important that we're trying to protect their ability to raise money anonymously.
I mean, 100%. And it's not just sort of the big organizations. All of the little organizations within your community that do this kind of work are also nonprofits, and they do yeoman's work too, and it's part of the American community.
So we saw some threats in a number of states this year, ones that would have really exposed people's information if they give to nonprofits. How many states were you tracking this year? And what did that threat look like? I tracked
over 40 states where I saw bills with potential threats for nonprofit privacy.
That's truly scary.
Yeah. I mean, not all of them sort of amount to serious threats, but as we said, some of nonprofits do engage in advocacy, which makes some amount of sense, right? So if you're a nonprofit that wants to, help the homeless, and there's a law in your state that prevents you from helping the homeless in some way, advocating for changing that law makes a lot of sense. So those kind of groups get closer to sort of political advocacy and things people are less attracted to. And when that happens, politicians see a relative threat there, and they use the threats of disclosure to dissuade some of those activities. And those are the kind of bills we see a lot.
Well, and it's not particular to blue or red states either, really. I mean, it seems it's pretty well across the board, which is also a frightening thing, that, there's threats to free speech being posed no matter what partisan makeup we see in a state.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, with 40 states, it can't be just the blue states or the red states. The flavor of the threat changes with the party, as you might expect. But at its core, this is sort of a fundamental political fight. Incumbent politicians have a stranglehold on power in a lot of different ways, and they want to get their ideas and their things done. Rightly so. But when people push back against that, when they think there's a different way to go, when they advocate for unpopular ideas, when they advocate occasionally against politicians who don't follow through on those ideas or try to hold them accountable, politicians from both parties say, hey, what are you doing? Let me see what weapons of the government I can use to dissuade that kind of activity.
Yeah, you see on the federal level too, right? There's and on the local level, like even sometimes well-meaning people really have a hard time resisting using the power and the coercive nature of government to advance what they want. It's hard to really be a defender of the Bill of Rights and particularly free speech when it's speech we don't like, maybe. And I think that's, when I look at like real champions, folks that we really admire in who hold public office, it's the folks who really have kind of a fidelity to the underlying principles that we see in our Constitution. But man, it's kind of rare, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, I in some sense feel for these politicians. They obviously think they're right, just like I think I'm right about the issues and beliefs I hold. And everyone thinks they're right. That's why they hold the beliefs that they hold. And so when they see people that are making arguments that they disagree with, and then those arguments are persuasive, they manage to convince other people that those arguments are good, I can see why they think to themselves, this is really bad. I have to do something about this. But the answer is always more speech, counter speech, better arguments, better associations, ways to get things done. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians fall back on what can I do? How can I expose this? How can I shut this group down? How can I deter them from advocating?
Yeah. So there was a specific threat in legislation in New Mexico that was pretty scary. So maybe tell us a story about that bill and what happened.
Sure. So New Mexico, like most states, has disclosure of donors for people who give specifically to political campaigns and political action groups, meaning if you donate to a campaign, that is disclosed. And the Supreme Court has said that's okay, that this is a free speech infringement, but it's allowable under the First Amendment because we're preventing corruption. You could be attempting to bribe those politicians. So we're going to allow this level of disclosure as a way of stopping any potential corruption. So that sort of campaign finance law already exists in New Mexico, like it does in most, really all of the 50 states and the federal government. In New Mexico, in that statute, we saw a attempted change by a politician who wanted some of these other nonprofits to have to disclose all of their donors as well, opening them up to potential political retribution. And in order to do this, he managed to change a single word in the New Mexico Code. The bill had one word change. It changed contribution to fund. And then any group that spent funds for anything that would be considered political in New Mexico's code, which was a wildly expansive definition that sort of meant anything, would have to disclose all of their donors. So that means basically any group that was running any ad about any issue would have fallen into this category and had complete disclosure regime as if they were a political committee.
So, Scott, I'll play devil's advocate. Why don't we want that kind of transparency? I mean, we always talk about transparency. Why shouldn't we be able to see who's given that money?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? And a lot of politicians think this disclosure is good. The easiest answer is that politicians know this dissuades people from giving to causes that might be politically unpopular. It dissuades people from crossing the aisle to give to causes that they might advocate for certain education policies, but they're a Democrat, and so it would conflict with those kind of things. They might advocate in the other direction. So that politicians are aware that there's a disclosure is dissuasive to free association and these nonprofit groups. Chuck Schumer somewhat famously said the purpose of these things is to shut down these groups from speaking. That's the entire sort of underlying goal of these things.
Kind of said the quiet part out loud there, huh?
Yes, he certainly did. Even if you think, though, that's good, right? We should still have to have sort of radical transparency. In an age where political polarization is so extreme, in a time where it is so easy to access this information, I can find out all of your contributions in a matter of seconds now with the internet. In the 1970s, when these laws were passed, I would have had to go to Washington, D.C. and look at microfiche in the FEC basement in order to find all your political donations. Now it's a few clicks away, and now the environment is so partisan and so hyper-partisan, there needs to be a space where we can privately associate without getting involved in all of those sort of partisan fights. And in the worst case scenario, obviously what we've seen is political violence come to be. And in order to have a thriving sort of nonprofit sector, a thriving space where we can exist and talk and debate ideas, we need to have a place where we can do so privately. And I'd also add that the groups that are actually making the speech in any of these spaces, whether it's be an ad advocating for an issue or flyers handing out, saying you want a certain ballot measure, or even something totally non-political, like just a charitable ad advertising your own charity. Those are all already disclosed for the group themselves. You know what group is making all of those speech. It's the second order disclosure where people are allowed to associate privately with that group. It's the people who give funds to that organization have no decision making about the ad or the speech itself that then should be protected.
I always think that one of the really poignant examples that helps crystallize in my mind why there should not be disclosure requirements for giving to nonprofits is one, you can think about your churches. That's a one that I think hits home to a lot of people. But also, you go back to the Jim Crow era, and the NAACP was their donor privacy was protected, and yet, because you could see very clearly there was intimidation going on to try to stop people from giving to the NAACP because they were being effective in changing laws in the South at the time. And I think that, to me, that helps crystallize there's a role here for this type of speech.
Yeah, 100%. And what's interesting about the NAACP example is, again, when Alabama or Arkansas, those southern states, went after the NAACP, they went after their donors not because they expected to stop all NAACP activity in the state, but because they want to engage in retribution for those donors. They wanted to know if there was a business owner whose license they could pull, who was secretly giving money to this cause they thought was incorrect. They wanted to know if there was some other measure of retribution they could do, unrelated, just to punish people for that association and speech. And so it emphasizes how important it is to have that privacy, not necessarily for the thing itself, but to protect yourself and protect others from potential retribution down the road.
I mean, why do you think that some of these state lawmakers are trying to allow this to expose this information? I mean, of course, some just want to have that chilling effect and discourage people from getting involved, but others try to say, noble things as to try to explain why they're doing it. What do you think's the motivation here?
I think for a lot of, I think there's bootleggers and Baptists on this issue, like many others. I think that a lot of them see it as a way to go after their political opponents, but others of them don't see a threat to disclosure the way that it actually exists in the world, because they themselves are so forthright. Politicians are always on TV, right? They're always giving public speeches. The idea to them that you might not be sure about whether or not you wanted to fully and robustly advocate for everything, but you might still support it a little bit. You might, want to engage in quiet speech, but not, shout it from the rooftops, is very hard for politicians to hear. And then you combine that with the money aspect, where they say, well, there's spending money going on here in order to further some of these speech products. They're running ads and things like that. I think that politicians then have a natural instinct to say, well, once money's involved, I'm allowed to regulate it, right? I'm allowed to get involved in those kind of discussions about what is and is not acceptable, to spend money on the airwaves or to spend money putting up flyers, that kind of thing. So
there's some efforts to regulate the use of AI in ads. But AI is being defined in kind of an odd way, right? Or in a nuanced way. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
100%. I mean, lawmakers, not surprisingly, like many of us, are trying to grapple with what AI is, what are the impacts on our everyday life. And one of the things lawmakers are particularly excited about, worried about, is AI in election spaces. They're worried about deepfakes that could pretend to be politicians and then say things they didn't actually say. And they want to regulate that, understandably, sort of to prevent those kind of things from happening. I try to point out to, folks I talk to that there is already a lot of laws that deal with these kind of things. If you're engaged in fraud, that is fraud, and you can be prosecuted for those kind of things. But since AI is kind of the hot new thing, a lot of legislators want to get in on the ground floor and promote those kind of things, particularly with bills talking about politics and political and issue areas. The problem is, what is AI is very difficult to define. And so far, I've seen politicians define it as computer technology, which means anything that has used a computer program to alter it. So this podcast is, I hope, going to be edited to take my worst moments out. And when that happens, you will have engaged in AI manipulation, according to some of the bills we have seen. Or if you...
you don't realize it, but I am actually an AI product right now. I'm not even here.
Yeah, I didn't realize it. That's great to hear. I'm glad you're on the cutting edge of these kind of things. But
yeah, they couldn't do better.
Yeah. Candidates anyone running political ads uses AI in these kind of definitions all the time. So they'll touch someone up with Photoshop, or they'll fly an American flag in the background of an ad that wasn't there in the real existence to sort of demonstrate, a level of patriotism. These kind of things all would have either been prohibited under some of these AI bills, or would have led to a whole host of new regulatory frameworks and regulations that are attempting to stop this kind of speech, which is unfortunate because while there isn't a huge AI boom yet in the sort of political speech space, some of these things would be great for candidates that don't have a lot of money. You can do things a lot cheaper with AI and computer technology. For people who want to run issue ads but don't have a ton of spending, we could get huge amounts of new speech and new advocacy without the huge cost associated with sort of traditional advocacy now. But some of these laws definitely are looking to stifle that before it ever gets started.
Yeah, I think it's probably a lot to be determined in the AI space, and as it kind of just bulls its way into the political speech space.
100%.
Just like the rest of our society, I suppose. Maybe, what are some of the things that some states are doing where they are trying to keep information private and trying to strike a good balance? Are there states that you see or measures in states that you think are pretty good?
Yeah, there's a lot states can do to sort of either proactively protect these kind of things or make it easier for people to engage in advocacy without running afoul of some of these more speech restricting laws. So there's one bill, the Personal Privacy Protection Act, which is passed in over 20 states. This bill basically says if the government does collect your personal information, if they're taking your address, your name, what charities you donate to, anything of that sort, it is illegal for government officials to then publicly disclose that information. So this prevents sort of the 2010 IRS scandal. We've seen other cases of this in the past where people think it might be embarrassing to disclose someone's political information or tax information. This bill basically says it is against the law for government officials to do that. And it has some exceptions where it's absolutely necessary, like the political committee stuff I've talked about. But it says otherwise, you should not be disclosing things. Sort of a baseline privacy protection for charitable donations. And if you have no reason to collect this information, you shouldn't collect it either, which is another sort of baseline level. Seems quite obvious, but is not the case in many states. So I'd recommend something like that. The other thing I've seen is, and this has come about with the unfortunate assassination of state senators in Minnesota, is redaction of addresses, even in instances where we do collect this sort of personal information about your thing. Mm-hmm. There's no reason for the government to need to connect where you live with a particular cause you support or charity you give money to, or even politician you support. And yet it is the case in all 50 states that some level of addresses are taken when you give money to some causes. We could just take that out of the code. We could go back to a base level of privacy in your home without sort of the necessary attacks on those kind of things.
So as we kind of wrap up, I'm not a smart lawyer like yourself, but I know enough that it seems to me, my reading of it is that the courts have been pretty protective of free speech when it comes to donor disclosure. Is that an accurate assessment? And kind of what have the courts said recently as it comes to the disclosure of contributions and the people making them?
Sure. So in a case, Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, which we are intimately familiar with, the court said that the government needs a compelling reason, a really good reason to collect any of this information. They need that reason whether they collect it for the government's own use. They need that information whether they're intending to distribute that publicly. And if they don't have that compelling good reason, and again, the only reason they have laid out explicitly that is a compelling good reason is preventing corruption, states should not be collecting this information. Now, unfortunately, it takes a very long time to get a case up to the Supreme Court. And so we have constant battles where states have decided to collect this information and then we fight it in litigation. So we have another case right now in New Jersey where the governor of New Jersey went to pregnancy centers. So he is a pro-choice governor. He does not like pro-life pregnancy centers and said, I am subpoenaing all of your donor information. I think you've committed a crime. I don't know what crime you've committed. It doesn't matter. I just want to sort of publicly disclose all of this donor information. That case was recently granted by the Supreme Court. We filed a brief in support of the pregnancy centers saying you can't do that. At a fundamental level, it is not the job of the government. It is not a compelling reason without criminal suspicion, subpoena the groups you don't like. And so we're going to continue to fight those kind of things in the court. But as you say, the court, once you get to the Supreme Court, is quite supportive of these kind of free speech protections in political speech and donor privacy spaces and all First Amendment spaces. The problem is it takes a very long time and a very specific case to get all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, there are 50 state legislators who think I can pass my bill at the margins and get there and get an effect before I ever get there. And that's not counting the federal government, which has the biggest and baddest stick with which to pass these laws.
Well, Scott, this is, been a lot of wonderful information about how, to really protect our freedom of speech. And in this case, through not, having unnecessary contribution disclosure. So if someone, kind of sees this in legislation in their state, and they're concerned about that a bill would expose people's private information, what do you recommend they look for?
Sure. So the easiest way that lawmakers engage in sort of these things is by expanding the campaign finance laws that already exist. So if you take a campaign finance law that already has an infrastructure to disclose donors to political committees and you apply it to all charities, that is the easiest change you can make within the law. And so that's the most common one we see out there. But I would also caution people, there are a lot of things and causes that this is the puppies and ice cream version of bill fighting. Nobody, for instance, wants any foreign interference in our elections or in our campaigns or in our political advocacy. I don't want that either. But oftentimes what you'll see is people smuggling in domestic disclosure threats along with bills that are intended to weed out foreign influence. So if you see those kind of things, I would have a red flag go up in your mind and be like, is this actually targeting illegal foreign influence? Or is this doing something else to get at someone's political enemies?
Well, Scott, thanks for fighting the good fight. Kind of protect all of our First Amendment rights. And as someone who works for a nonprofit, I'm particularly appreciative. So, thanks for all the hard work that you're doing and staying vigilant and keeping our teams kind of vigilant to, block any of these really unnecessary disclosure threats. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.